if we start, do I do it? There we go. If we start thinking about, I guess, what are the economists saying? What are we seeing in the market? And particularly when we're working with businesses in the retail consumer sector, whether that be in transport and logistics or other areas, what are the key things that are being considered through what we can see in the economy? The first point here, and again, forgive me because what I will do is overlay some of the recent stats that we've had. CPI inflation is released on the 18th, but the projections for 24 really still focusing on higher gas prices. For those that don't know, for example, there are strikes over in Australia. So there are things that are happening whereby there is forecast that those gas prices will potentially rise again in Q1. But what we know is we've seen a bit of a fall there. The price cap has been removed. So actually, what does that mean for people's pockets? As we all know, it means it's there or there net. Headline inflation fell to 6.9% in July, largely faster than the Bank of England expected. And that was driven largely by food. What are we seeing now? We're seeing that, if we go on to the next slide, she says, hopefully, there's a big watch for the government and for particularly the Bank of England in terms of services that are sat there quite sticky at 7.4%. So there's a big watch on there, and the fear, as I mentioned, of the LNG strikes over and natural gas rising. Forecast if those strikes were to continue is possibly a 10% wholesale increase on natural gas. Thinking about headline CPI inflation and that falling 6.8% in July, that was broadly in line with expectations. Core inflation remained flat. There's a bit of a delay on this screen. Cost pressures, what we've seen is a continued fall, and hopefully that's something that resonates with you guys here today as well. Key point here being the volume of goods bought dropped. So there was a fall in goods bought across June and July by 1.2%. Food store sales, the figures quoted by the PPI was around a fall of 2.6%. Although what we're seeing, and I guess the numbers that are starting to come through from August, we all know the weather was a lot better. August is looking at about a 4.1% rebound. And then this is the one, I guess, that is slightly out of date because we sent this off before we had the latest news in terms of where we were with wages. So until this week, what we were saying was pay growth was being really outstripped by consumer price inflation. Actually, what we saw, and I'm sure you all heard in the news earlier this week, UK wages grew at their fastest pace on record in the 3 months up to July. The Office for National Statistics was quoting 7.8%, the highest since 2001, excluding bonuses. What does that mean? It means essentially what we're saying is pay is matching price increases at the moment. Watch out, there was a slight uptick in unemployment, and that also, if you look at most of the forecasting, the forecast is that that will continue to rise. Sector specific, we know there's a big challenge, particularly cold chain, logistics, etc. We know that actually recruiting talent is still a challenge in a number of those areas. So this is a broad look as opposed to being very specific. What does that mean in terms of key trends? I guess I can't believe we still talk about COVID in many ways, but actually we have experienced a huge amount of shock, and you guys, and I think Paul, you were mentioning some of those before. I think if we think about where we are currently, geopolitical, climate, etc., change, shocks are here to stay. And what we see more and more is when we're doing, for example, due diligence with businesses, that is something that's really being tested and factored into the resilience of plans for those continued shocks. Inflation's likely to drop like a stone. That's what I guess, all the economists pretty much. If you read most of the economists, that's what's being said. But we've got to take that in the round of understanding what's going on with wages, stickiness of wage increases, some of those shocks that we're expecting to continue to see, particularly in the areas of energies, etc. So we are expecting that tightening to continue. Let's wait and see what happens with interest rates in 2 weeks, I think it is, announcement. Question mark what may or may not happen there. There is an expectation that those interest rates increases will start to slow, if not stop. But we do need to keep a close eye on inflation. And there may be more surprises. We all know we've got an election to come. Where we like to spend a good proportion of time is just thinking about actually what a consumer's telling us. So for those that haven't seen this, at PwC since 2008, periodically through the year, we survey consumers to understand where are they, what's their spending intentions, how are they feeling about the economy, how are they feeling about their position and their financial position. And there's some really interesting things coming out of that consumer sentiment survey that we did more recently. So June 23 was the last one we did. There will be another one in mid-October. Since September, the first thing to say is we were at quite an all-time low in terms of our sentiment, so consumer sentiment in September. What we've seen last year, is an increase. Every single time there's been an increase in how people have felt and how consumers have been feeling. And it's increasingly positive, and it's largely springing back to what we would call more or less a norm in the UK. In the UK versus other countries, it might not surprise you to know we are slightly pessimistic. So we do tend to be pessimistic versus the other countries that PwC does this in. It's now the highest it's been in 18 months. That's across all demographics. So we're seeing all demographics feel better about where they are in terms of relation to the economy. Breaking that down a little bit more, I guess 18 to 24s have typically been the hardest socio-economic group to have real positivity. And we've been seeing that come through an improving trend. Variance has narrowed quite a bit between the economic groups as well. The less affluent and have definitely seen an uptick. So the budget in April, some of the announcements around living wage and some of the support mechanisms, they're actively telling us actually we do have a bit more disposable income and we are feeling a bit more positive. Under 25s remain positives, and a lot of us in the room probably fit this, but the 45 to 54 age group is the least positive of that socio-economic group. Interesting, given paying all the bills, putting the children through school, etc. Overall, though, so there's a lot of positivity there, but overall spending intention is still negative. And what do we mean by that? We mean, with the exception of grocery, which we will come on to, people are saying, but I am going to cut back. My intention is to spend less. We do find that, again, leading into the UK being a little bit pessimistic, we do tend to see that actually how much people say they're going to pull back, in reality, how much they do. There does tend to be, they probably say they're going to pull back a little bit more than they do. But overall, across all areas, there is an intention to spend less. In the last few surveys, that was increasingly negative. And we've seen that start to loosen, except grocery. Now, what I will say about grocery is people are allowing for inflation in their spending intentions. So largely they're not saying, I'm going to buy more. They are saying, I'm listening to the news, I'm looking on the shelves, and so I'm allowing for the fact that I'm going to have to spend more. And then what we'll do from that point is Alex will just chat through a little bit what we then see in terms of CEOs. So when we talk to businesses, annual CEO survey, when we take in context the economy, when we think about where consumers are, actually what are businesses saying to us and business leaders saying to us about their priorities?
Thank you, Claire. So CEO survey. We survey over 4,000 CEOs from over 100 countries every year. It's the 26th year that we've run this. And what we actually see is that CEOs are expecting a significant level of change within their business. So taking the economic indicators that Claire's talked through and the consumer sentiment, nearly 40% of the CEOs we surveyed said that their current business model isn't economically viable within the next decade. So they are expecting a significant level of change that they're going to have to respond to. So what are the forces that are driving that? Well, 50% of those CEOs said that changing consumer demand, changes in regulation, labour and skills shortages, as well as technology disruption, will be some of the key factors that impact their business, with 40% saying that supply chain disruption and the transfer to new energy sources also being key. And we know within cold chain some of those really hit home. So consumers wanting more choice, that's value for money, knowing the provenance of their goods and where they've come from. The labour challenge I think we've covered, and I'll come on to a bit more of that within the next couple of slides, is really key within the cold chain. And we know that that is driving investment in technology as well as we go forwards. So if we look at that over the immediate short-term priority over the next 12 months, as well as over the next 5 years, we see that there are a few consistencies across both the short and the longer term. So inflation remains number one priority on all CEOs' agendas currently, and that's expected, and it still remains within the next 5 years. So CEOs are planning for that to be a long-term problem that they're resolving. Equally, macroeconomic challenges and geopolitical pieces remain both short and longer term. We know that the UK and the US both have elections next year, and there are continued geopolitical incidences, and we know things around the coups that we've seen in Africa with Gabon recently. All of that uncertainty brings risk that businesses will have to respond to, and that uncertainty brings challenges and the need to adapt and change. So how are businesses responding? So when we ask the CEOs on what they're actually doing about all of these challenges and threats that they see, they're saying that they are looking at how they cut costs, and they're looking at how they spur revenue growth. And that could either be through increasing their prices, which we've talked about, or equally looking at product diversification and what they can do. So 52% of the CEOs said they are already reducing operating costs. But what's interesting when we look down into the detail below that, only 19% are looking at hiring freezes. 16% are actually looking at reducing their workforce currently, an even smaller amount in the single digits around actually reducing compensation. So if all those focuses are not on people, we know that therefore CEOs looking at reducing operating costs are focusing on procuring things better, all of their non-staff costs, and driving efficiency within that operation. And then when we look at attrition has been a huge factor over the last number of years, so much so it's been coined the Great Resignation. And when we ask CEOs around what they expect to happen with attrition, generally they expect it to remain at this high level. More CEOs thinking it will actually increase rather than decrease over the next 12 months in terms of that attrition and retention challenge. So in terms of the investments that CEOs are therefore making, 3/4 of the CEOs are investing in automating their processes, upskilling their workforce, and investing in different technology like AI and advanced analytics. And when we look at the drivers behind that, 60% are doing that to reinvent their business, whereas 40% are actually doing that just to maintain and keep current status quo. And a bit further down the agenda in terms of the investment piece that you see here is actually around the climate change and decarbonisation, which we'll come on to further down in the next piece. So that's what CEOs are currently saying. What I'm now going to cover is we do a grocery retail logistics survey every year, and as a major proponent for the cold chain industry, we'll just delve into what they're currently thinking. So again, inflation and cost is number one on the agenda. Grocery retailers are spending between 3 and 6% of their revenue on warehousing and distribution each year. And when we look at how they combat those inflationary pressures, every single person that we interviewed said they are renegotiating contracts. So that comes back to not a focus on people, but a focus on other costs and renegotiating where they can. 80% say they're looking at reducing stock loss within the chain. 60% are looking at how they optimise by looking at inbound and outbound frequency of deliveries, and 40% looking at how they improve their hedging or forward buying. We've also talked about the war on talent and the challenges that businesses face. The CEOs showed that in their responses, but actually it's even more acute when we look at the grocery logistics results. 33% attrition within warehousing, 13% attrition within transport. And the ways that people are responding to this is through increased pay, looking at bonuses, but equally looking at softer benefits like improving facilities, and other elements around benefit schemes that you can offer to employees to attract and retain that talent. And actually that's led to a 40% increase in costs of over 12.5%. So 40% of respondents said their costs in warehousing increased by over 12.5%. 60% of the respondents said that their transport people costs had increased by 7.5% to 12.5%. So huge cost pressures to be dealing with in the people. And that means people are looking elsewhere for cost reduction initiatives that they need to be focusing on. Looking a bit further out, we're seeing that capacity and service levels are a problem that's looming over the next 18 months to 3 years. So 60% said they needed to invest in additional space over that time frame, largely due to increasing in store numbers, as well as expected organic growth, as well as an increase expected within stock holding. So how are they going to meet that capacity constraint? Well, 80% are planning to do that in-house, so purchasing or leasing new assets themselves, or 60% looking at within their current 3PL network. Actually, very few are looking to new 3PL relationships or looking at leveraging their existing sites because that's already been utilised. And finally, the last piece here is around ESG. While the CEOs had it further down on their agenda about investment, actually when we zoom in on grocery retail, it's a huge priority. So 60% say it's a key initiative for their next year. Only 14% of the respondents said they aren't using any alternative fuels at all already, but 100% of respondents had that within their plan for the next year. So a really massive focus within grocery logistics that goes against potentially some of the investment areas that CEOs are seeing, and making sure that it's not just a 5-year priority, but the here and now and immediate focus. And I'll now just hand back to Claire to focus and summarise it.
We're over on time, so I'll be super quick. There was a bit about so what. So we tried to summarise, go back. We tried to summarise for you what does that all sort of mean, and what are we seeing and what are we hearing in terms of so what. So you can see through the kind of circle that we have here. ESG we've touched on, and you guys have got more sessions on that, but also the circular economy and waste management was a key theme that came out quite frequently. Thinking about logistics and fleet, again, your area of expertise, but cost-effective ways to manage assets through the whole life cycle is a big focus that, particularly when we're talking to businesses who are thinking about the future, it's a key area that we're frequently asked to go and investigate. There's challenges, as you know, around the driver and haulage market and lots of initiatives in that space. Automation, Paul touched on, it's always challenging to invest in these sorts of areas when it's a high inflationary market. And we're definitely seeing that and hearing that from a lot of our clients. Along with that, we're hearing a lot about food cataloguing and sortation, and you touched on food security before, but the field to fork traceability and food safety standards are a big focus that we're hearing from a number of our clients. Resilience and thinking about geopolitical, flexing resource portfolios, etc., big area of focus. And then when we think about cost saving, we touched on it's challenging, particularly in this market, inflationary market, lots of headwinds in terms of wages, etc. So again, playing into the space of automation, AI-powered analytics, planning, etc. And then finally, competition. What does that logistics capability look like in a competitive market? Where is that competition and what's driving that competition? And then we just summarised here, which I won't go through, but in terms of what that all means and what clients are saying to us, really focusing on understanding and managing costs. Key word there, data-led on costs. Even in a challenging market, when you really understand the driver of your costs, you can really understand the value that cost is driving. thinking about those multi-tiered workforce plans, that resilience. We're seeing more and more collaboration in that space as well, and process automation, even in a market where it's challenging, really thinking about where the best place to focus is. Thank you.